Tonight, if you've been reading along with us, you'll be reading. We usually, in our evening services, we take a moment to talk about one of the scriptures that you've actually read this morning. If you haven't tracked that with us, or this week, you'll find at the back table there some guides to the reading plan that we're following this year. You get the opportunity to choose the feast, which is 4 or 5 chapters a day. You can choose the meal, which is kind of like a couple of chapters, or you can choose the snack, which is a few verses, all from the same scriptures. And we're all doing this together this year. And if you haven't started yet, I encourage you to do it. Here's a good time to start. Sometimes we let our New Year's resolutions go, or we sometimes don't even, we're afraid to start, But I'm just saying, let's start now is a good time as any. I'd like to just start with this saying, which you probably have heard before. It's the blind leading the blind. You'll have heard that saying before, right? It's a common saying. It's like the blind leading the blind. Now, basically, this is the idea that there are people who don't know what they're doing, leading people who need to know what to do. I'm going to say it again so you can get it, right? It's basically this idea that there's people who don't know what they're doing, leading people who really need to know what to do. That's the blind leading the blind. It's sort of this idea that the people who are unable to help themselves are being led by other people who are no better at the job. They're really not equipped to help the other person at all. Am I making myself clear, or are you still in the dark? You see what I did there? Some of you did, right? Sometimes, it's hard to comprehend. We've got the blind people leading the blind. It's the people who don't know leading the people who should know, and that's the way it sometimes is. What happens is if you're reading today, you would have read in Mark 10. Now, I've taken the message from Mark 10, which is actually the very last of this week's readings, and it's the very last part of that chapter 10 that I'm going to preach on tonight. And it's actually a story about a blind guy, very similar to this idea. It truly fits this idea of the blind leading the blind in some ways. And the story, if you're familiar with it, it's a story about a guy named Bartimaeus. And Bartimaeus, or, Bartimaeus, or something, however you might say it, basically he was a beggar because that was the only way he could earn some money for the fact that he was unable to work. And so we're going to join the story there in Mark chapter 10, verse 46. And it says this, and they came to Jericho, and as he was, this is Jesus and the people who are following him, and as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all of the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped and said, call him. And they called the blind man, saying to him, take heart, get up, he's calling you. And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, what do you want me to do for you? And the blind man said to him, Rabbi, let me recover my sight. And Jesus said to him, go your way, your faith has made you well. And immediately he received his sight and followed him on the way. Now, this is one of those stories in the Bible that I just love. There's a few, because I like stories. Stories I can relate to. I like to tell stories, and I like to read stories. I'm not very good with facts and figures like you will be reading in Numbers right now if you're on that reading plan with us. And I'm not real good with facts and figures, but stories, they say so much to me. And partly this story, maybe I love it because my parents used to read it to me in a little booklet in a series of books called the Arch Books. And they had lots of pictures and it was written in a kind of poetry or kind of a rhyming or lilting style. And I used to love that because my dad, my dad if you've been around for a while, he's a bit of a poet. And he likes to write these rhyming things. So I think my dad kind of got into it. And I loved these books. And I loved this story about blind Bartimaeus. Maybe I loved it because he was this guy who he was like an outcast, and Jesus was walking along, and he actually stopped, and the crowd had to kind of cop it a little bit because they'd all been saying one thing, and then they had to say another thing, and all of a sudden the guy who was left out became a part of the crowd. Maybe it's because I have often felt like I was the one that was on the outside of the crowd and didn't always feel like I could get in, so maybe this story spoke to me for that reason. But either way, however we got this, I love this story. And out of this story, I think there are some things that we can learn. Now, I tried to think how we could word this, but the bottom line is this is a blind man giving us directions. Or this is a blind man who's helping us to see some things that we wouldn't have normally seen. So what's the first thing we can see? And we could be taught this from a blind man. That's this. It comes from verse 26 to 40. I've written the wrong thing there. 46 to 47. And here's the thing. If you need help, call out to Jesus. I don't want to be too simplistic about this, but from this story, that's the first thing I get out. If you need help, then call out to Jesus. We'll see this as we read that scripture. And verse 46 says, and then they came to Jericho, and as Jesus was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside, and when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. If you have something you need, call out to Jesus. Now, I know you're sitting there thinking to yourself, well, that's kind of obvious, Lex. Especially when it comes to being a Christian. Of course you'd call out to Jesus if you needed help, but I beg to differ. It might be obvious, but it's not very common. Not amongst non-believers or amongst Christians. It seems to me from my experience in the Western world specifically, that while many non-Christians forget to turn to God at all, many Christians forget to turn to God as well. It's like they try every possible solution they can. They're blind. They can't see. It's affecting their whole life. In fact, it's so much so that they barely can earn a living. They're poor and they're oppressed, and they're sitting in the only thing they own is the coat and perhaps the bowl they have to beg with, and they still resist calling out to Jesus. It's almost like we're saying, I'm happy staying like I am, and I will figure out anything I can do, anything other than asking God for help, because he wouldn't really have time for me. He wouldn't really be interested in me. That seems to be my experience from how Christians want to run their spiritual life. I don't understand why. We offer opportunities for people to be prayed for. Come, we'll pray for you. We'll come to you and pray for you. And many who we find out much later on struggle through so many things and didn't even ask for help. Didn't even ask God for help. Just struggled through on their own. I don't understand why that is, but the point of today simply from here, learning this lesson, something that helps us see clearly, learning it from a blind man is this. If you need help, then call out to Jesus. Ask him first and not last. That's how God's economy works. And I'm not talking about praying to find a car parking spot. If that's who you are, I'm good for that. If you want to do that, that's fine for me. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about praying to God when things are desperate. When you find out that you're financially in trouble, don't go and get a loan from the bank first. Go to God first. If you find out that you have to go to hospital, I'm good for that. But just talk to God. Don't leave it at the last point. Ask him for help. This is what I think I can see here in this passage is call out to God for help. So here's the second thing that we can learn, something that helps us to see from something a blind man can teach us, and that's this. If you're a disciple of Jesus, then get out of the road of those who need him. And I'll explain in a minute. Mark 10:48 says this, and many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. I know it might sound harsh, but I'm trying to imagine here that there's a crowd of people. It clearly says that there's a crowd. It says there's Jesus, and then there's his disciples, and then there's a crowd of people around him. And they're off on their way doing their merry little thing. Now, these are the able-bodied people in the church, if you like. They're the ones who can follow. They're the ones who have the ability to walk. And there they are thronging around Jesus. And dare you believe this for a minute, those very people firstly are obscuring Jesus. I can imagine there is blind Bartimaeus sitting right there by the temple, by the gate of the city. And he's sitting down and he's got his begging bowl. And there's a crowd there. He can't even see Jesus. I mean, you know he can't see, but he's literally blocked out of anything to do with it because of the crowd. And then if you could sort of imagine with me, here are these Christians, these people who are actually able to follow Jesus, and they're completely obscuring Jesus. And not only that, they're turning around to this guy who's desperate for some help. And they're saying, just shut up. I mean, can you just picture this? Here are people who are following Jesus. What do they want from Jesus? They want help from him, right? That they actually see in him, he's the Messiah, that he's actually the one that can bring them help. Salvation, in fact, that's what they see from him. And so they want to follow because they're hanging off every word and they're interested in what he has for them. And those very people who want Jesus have turned around to someone who desperately needs Jesus and told him to shut up. Now, I know this is not us, but the point is sometimes I think in the church what happens is we're the ones that actually obscure the master from the people who need him. You know, we build our nice big churches and we kind of hide off in that little area there. And there we are worshiping and we have a wonderful time and we've got Jesus exclusively to ourselves. And isn't it awesome? You know, and we kind of follow him and we're on the tail of Jesus and we're all going, yeah, we are with Jesus and it's going to be great. Would you just shut up, please? Because we're trying to follow Jesus and we've got such a great worship service. And I know you're begging for us to come over there and help you, but you're annoying us. We're busy. Sometimes this happens in the church. We're so busy following Jesus that we forget to actually be like Jesus. Now, I know this is tough for us. I'm not trying to put the guilt on. I'm just reading this passage and out pops this truth, I think, that firstly we have this idea that the first idea is that, where's it gone? Yeah, you've got to call out to Jesus if you've got something you need. But then you don't want to be the person who's in the way. Now, actually, I don't mind that we love Jesus and we want Jesus. I just think it's not so cool when we're the ones who are blocking the people who really need him. You know, to me, it's a real challenge, and we have no time sometimes for the people who desperately need Jesus. But Jesus has set us to be his ambassadors. You know, we're the ones who should be actually drawing people to Jesus. You know, we're sometimes a little bit like, I don't have time for you. And Jesus doesn't have time for you. We're like his little bodyguards, you know. Jesus definitely won't have time for you, so can I tell you, I don't have time for you either. But actually, Jesus is the kind of person that has time for someone like this. Which I guess leads me to my third thing, and that is that we can learn this from the story of a blind man. He can help us see things more clearly, and that is if you are following Jesus, then it also includes following his example. And Jesus, in Mark 10:49, he says, and Jesus stopped and said, call him. And you've got to see a little bit of hypocrisy here, right? Call him over. Now, I don't know if it was the same people who were saying, shut up, be quiet. But then they started to say, come over. He wants to talk to you. Can you see a little bit like that? You know, sometimes that happens. It's a bit of a chameleon thing that's happening here. We want to please Jesus, and so we don't think about it until all of a sudden he says, you better go and do it, so we go and do it. And yet what I think Jesus wants from us is to act like he acts, to think like he thinks. You know, it wasn't like Jesus didn't have anything to do with his time. If you know about the story, he's headed to Jerusalem. Actually, he's on his way to be ultimately crucified in that city. And he's being crucified for you and me. So he had a big job to do, right? He's definitely on a mission. That mission is to save the whole world, right? And I mean, you and I, we've got missions to do. We've got things that we need to do. But we didn't have a mission like Jesus, who through his death and resurrection was going to offer salvation to the entire world. Literally, you were on his mind that day as he's headed off towards Jerusalem. And on his way there towards Jerusalem, he's going to encounter this great moment of history, this pivotal moment of history where things are going to change from the old covenant where we had to keep going to God with our sacrifices to the new covenant where one sacrifice was made. It was him. You don't think God was on a mission? He was on the mission of all missions. Not to be dissuaded. Even at one point there, Peter, who said to him, you really can't do this. You can't go up and die. That's not the way it's really meant to be. Jesus turned to him, one of his key disciples, and he said to him, get behind me, Satan, because you do not have in mind the things of God. In other words, don't dissuade me. You are not going to dissuade me from the purposes that God has called me to. You don't think Jesus was on a mission? He was on a mission. And yet in that mission, he chose time to pause. You know what? I'm going to go and die for the whole world. But I've got time for a beggar on the side of the road right now. I think I could spend a moment here, don't you think? Jesus sets this example for us. And so when we read this, we could learn this from a blind man, from the story of a blind man. It could help us to see more clearly what we should be doing is if Jesus comes by and we have a need, we should call out to him. And we should also get to the point where, if we're a disciple, we should get out of the way so others can find him, but that we should also follow his example and literally be able to, no matter how busy we are, no matter how important the task is that we have to do, no matter how much we have it on our mind to go there, never do it at the expense of the Bartimaeuses in our life who need our help. Never get so caught up in the things we're doing in church, in the worship that we have, in the places that we need to go, in the things that need to be done right here in church that we actually obscure the people who need Jesus, and never go so far as that we are so important and so engrossed in the direction we're going that we don't have time to actually help those who are in need. A few weeks ago, I mentioned in a vision message that one of the things we need in our church is margin. That if we're going to be who Christ wants us to be, we have to be different to the world whose all their margins are filled up with all sorts of things. They literally don't have time. But if we're to follow Jesus' example, even in the busiest time of his life, headed from here to there, he still had enough margin to pause for a Bartimaeus. And I guess that's the challenge for all of us in some ways is how much time do you have for Bartimaeus? For that person who's going, can you help me? Can you please help me? How much time do you have for Bartimaeus? That's the example that Jesus set us. And here's the fourth thing from verse 50 to 51. It's if Jesus asks you what he can do for you, tell him exactly what you want. In fact, Jesus is often asking you, and maybe even always asking you, what do you want me to do for you? What do you want me to do for you? Julie? What do you want me to do for you? What do you want me to do for you, Scott? What do you want me to do for you, Lenore? What do you want me to do for you, John? What do you want me to do for you? That's kind of what Jesus asked. What do you want me to do for you? Now, what I suggest is this. We can read it here in verse 50 to 51. It says, and throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, what do you want me to do for you? And the blind man said, look, I'd really like it if you could help my auntie. She's not too well and she's in hospital. Actually, no, he said, could you really help me? I need a bit more money today. I haven't made enough today. I usually make about 50 denarii, but today it's only 25 and I need a bit of help. He could have said, I need a new coat. My coat's not, it's not keeping me warm. Can I please have a new coat? Sometimes when we come to Jesus, this is exactly what we do. We ask for everything else that around us, and we ask for everybody else, but we don't come specifically with that thing that we need. You know what he said? He didn't say any of those things. He said, you know what? I really want you to restore my sight. I want to be able to see. Do you need something from Jesus? don't ask for something else. Be very specific. Tell him exactly what you want. We think about this at the start of this whole idea is that if Jesus is walking by and you need something, then ask him. Right? If he says, what do you want, then tell him. In fact, tonight what we're going to do for our prayer time after the message is I'm just going to have an altar call here. And in that altar call, what I'm going to say is, you know what? Do you have something you want to ask Jesus for? Then come forward. I'll pray with you. The prayer team will pray with you. Come forward. You know, you're going to just come and you're going to say, Jesus, this is what I'm begging you for this. I really need this. Look, it could be anything. It could be for health. It could be for a family member who needs to know Jesus. It could be for a job. I'm begging you for this, Jesus. I need this right now. It could just because you are more of God. You want the fullness of His Spirit. You want to know that presence of God in your life. It could be anything like that. You could just say, Jesus is kind of walking past and in a sense you hear him and you say, can you help me, Jesus? Would you have mercy on me? And then he'll come to you and say, what do you want? And so tonight I want to give you that opportunity. He might say to you tonight, and while you're sitting here listening to me, I want you to imagine Jesus saying to you, what do you want me to do for you? In fact, let's do that right now. We're just going to pause. I want you to think of Jesus. Close your eyes. This is just an exercise, right? Sometimes God uses exercises like this, and sometimes it doesn't work for some people. But if you close your eyes right now, and I want you to think these are the words of Jesus right now. I'm going to speak them. And I want you to think he's speaking directly to you. And then I want you to answer the question that he asks you. So here's the question Jesus wants to ask you. He wants to ask you this. What do you want me to do for you? What do you want me to do for you? And you know, when you pray, when you speak to God, and you know, he speaks to you and asks you that question, and sometimes what leaps to some of your minds is an immediate thing. Straight away, it just pops in your head. I don't want you to discount that thing that popped into your head, even if it's a little bit on the left or right of what you're thinking. And in that moment, God, what I want God to do for you is I want him to reveal it to you. So you can say, you know what, this is the thing that popped in my head. This is what I think God wants me. You know, or you might know immediately there's an issue that you want to bring to him. Tonight you're going to have that opportunity. You can come forward for a time of prayer. You know, we're going to have some songs and that sort of stuff, and then you get this opportunity to pray. So I just want to offer you that. And then look, finally, here's another thing that we can learn from the story of a blind man, something that'll help us to see. And that's this. If Jesus helps you, don't forget to follow him. You know, we can see that in verse 52. And Jesus said to him, go your way, your faith has made you well. And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. When Bartimaeus got what he needed, he followed Jesus. And so for some Christians, it's actually the opposite. We get what we need, and when we're out of trouble, you know, we don't follow. Sometimes we make this promise to God. You know, when I'm in trouble, I go, you know, God, if you'll just get me out of this one, promise you, I'm going to read my Bible more, I'm going to pray more, I'm going to do whatever. And, you know, I'm not sure those promises are really meant to be made. Sometimes I think they're pretty hollow. But you know what? What we could do is certainly we can follow God. We can certainly make that our priority. Not just to receive from him, but actually give to him. I think this is part of worship, really, if you think about it. Sometimes we think it's all about receiving. I'm not so sure it is all about receiving. We've received grace and we've received love, and what God expects in return is this kind of giving of ourselves to him, you know. That's what it's about. And so, you know, sometimes we're kind of like the 10 lepers, you know. All of them were healed, but 9 didn't bother to come back and say thanks. But 1 did. He kind of knew something was going on. And I think that's the kind of worshipers God's looking for, those who say, thank you, God, for your grace. Thank you, God, for your love. And I choose to continue to love you and to serve you. So there's some things we can learn from a blind man, some things that can help us to see more clearly. And these are them. If you need help, call out to Jesus. If you're a disciple, get out of the road of those people who need him. If you follow Jesus, then also follow his example. If Jesus asks you what he can do for you, tell him exactly what you want. And if Jesus helps you, don't forget to follow him.